Hello, and welcome to YWe Talk, a platform for leaders and visionaries to discuss important community issues that face women, children, and communities of color. Here, we raise awareness and create solutions in the space of indifference. I'm your host, Dr. LaRhonda Magras, CEO of YWCA Central Alabama. Since our inception, YWCA has worked to address some of the most pressing issues of the day, issues that impact women and people of color. Every day, we get up and do the important work of creating a more just and equitable community by ensuring that families have access to quality childcare and early learning experiences, supporting victims of domestic violence as they seek shelter from abuse or work toward economic advancement, and providing housing options that are affordable. These are social justice issues. YWCA Central Alabama's programs were developed in a space of systemic inequities related to gender, race, and poverty. Let's be clear. These inequities are not unique to our community, and in fact, exist in far too many communities across the country. Our dedication to ending systemic racism and to women's empowerment is what shapes the YW's identity as a social justice organization. For today's discussion, we thought it would be impactful to deconstruct the complexities of social justice and examine this popular term through the lens of equity in access, agency, advocacy, and solidarity in action. This is YWe Talk. I am so excited to introduce our esteemed panelists today. To reserve time, you can read their biographies online at ywcabham.org. I am so glad to have you here with us today. First, Dr. Olivia Cook, who is with Miles College. She's a professor there and executive director of the Center for Economic and Social Justice. Did I get that right, Dr. Cook?
Yes, you did.
Good. Woo! All right. And Dr. Michelle Allen, Diversity Education Director at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Welcome. And Lenice Emanuel, the Executive Director of Alabama Institute for Social Justice. Good afternoon to you, ladies. I am so pleased to have you here with us, and I really am looking forward to our conversation and dialogue today. And I want to start first with something I'll ask each of you. And first, what does social justice mean in the 21st century? You know, we hear this a lot now for sure. And so what does it mean, and how do you encounter it, social justice, in your everyday life? And I think I will start with you, Olivia.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you all again so much for the warm invitation today. I have to give a major shout out to Miss Daphne Portis for the warm invite. I'm excited to be here. So I know social justice has become this popular term, as you have noted, Dr. Magras, where everyone is using it, right? And so for me, social justice means that everyone's human rights are not only respected, but they're also protected. So it means that everyone deserves the same economic, social, political, rights and opportunities, regardless of where they are or who they are, right? So of course, this does not guarantee, a society where everything will be perfect and everybody will be happy in what we have, but it does mean that everyone will have the same equal opportunities to get the type of life that they want. And so to me, it's ultimately the fairness as it manifests in society.
I love that.
And in terms of, I know the second part to your question, how do I see it in the work that I do? So for me, it's a lot in my research, in the volunteer opportunities I take, and also in the programs I create. So I look at each of those through a social justice lens. And to give a concrete example with my research, so my research trajectory really looked at the advancement of African-American women senior leaders to those top executive level positions. So I wanted to make sure how do we get them to those positions, and how also are they authentic in their leadership style when they get to those positions? So for me, I look for those gaps in the literature on African American women senior leaders, and I look to fill them. And so for me, I found that they have been underrepresented in the literature because they're also underrepresented in society. We don't see them a lot in those executive leadership positions. I think it's getting better, but we haven't seen them historically in those executive leadership positions. So for me, I look to find those gaps, and I also look to fill them.
Oh my gosh, I love that. So such richness there. And Michelle, I will ask you the same question.
Absolutely. So for me, building off of what Dr. Cook shared, social justice is a righting of wrongs, historical wrongs, cultural wrongs, political wrongs. It's a righting of wrongs in a way that brings in exactly what Dr. Cook mentioned, equity, right? Really thinking about equal access based on what each individual community and individual person is in need of, taking consideration of what each person is bringing to the table and offering equitable access to the desired outcome. So for me, it's always a thinking about how we can be intentional to consider the most marginalized and subordinate of those who are among us, and in doing what we can do to right the wrongs that historically have been in place, either de facto laws or just a de jure climate of marginalization or oppression. So social justice is an attempt, a way, a tool to right those wrongs. And how am I engaged in that on a day-to-day basis? I would say personally, having a few underrepresented identities myself, just occupying space, showing up and being given the room to authentically be myself means that I can tap other people into that same space. So claiming space is a big part of that for me, and how I show up as a queer Black woman. So just my identity and how I present myself and how I am allowed and how I take up space. I want to be very clear with that. For people, particularly women with underrepresented identities, space won't be given, right? We have to take it. And so that's where critical geography comes in, right? That means, I'm going to occupy this role. To Dr. Cook's point, I'm going to be a director and hopefully an executive director and a VP, AVP, president, so on and so forth, and use my identities to make room for others. But professionally, the work that I'm afforded to do and very fortunate to do in an office like our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at UAB is to be an arm of social justice. So I'm the educational arm, right? I'm working at an institution that is being intentional. I work with the vice president, Dr. Dilworth, that is intentional about considering the most marginalized and underrepresented folks at the enterprise. And then using diversity education as a way to educate people who are genuinely curious about what their role in marginalizing and oppressing others have been in ways that they can get free. And that's how I look at social justice.
Oh my gosh. Oh, this is going to be tough. This is really, you all are so awesome. Lenice, please jump in here.
Absolutely. So since both of my co-panelists have given such great technical explanations, I don't really want to repeat that. But when I think about social justice for me, I think about this weight loss strategy, right? That we've all heard by now, where they say diets don't work. That you must have a lifestyle change if you're really going to have a healthy life. It must become a part of your everyday existence. And so healthy eating, for example, it really must be approached as being incorporated into everything that you do. How you think about food, the types of foods that you eat, how much do you eat, thinking about portion control and what it means to be measured in your approach to food, et cetera, et cetera. And so for me, what that means in the context of social justice in a 21st century world is that I'll put it to you like James Baldwin says. He says that to be relatively conscious is to be in a state of rage almost all the time. So that means that here in America, there is injustice everywhere. You cannot walk out of your front door without seeing, and in most instances, experiencing injustice. And so this country's foundation was built upon the exploitation of human capital. And we know that historically, there's been a spectrum of labor and human capital institutions that have existed. And so for the first time in America's history, because of the Great Resignation, this country is experiencing what I like to say, what it means to be a one-trick pony, right? That there was no backup plan in this country on how to maintain our economic systems beyond the capitalist model, where jobs and business models are constructed on the backs of the most marginalized in this country. So for me, social justice is that. It is actually acknowledging that those things exist in this country. It is being intentional, as my co-panelists have said, about going into spaces and creating equity, not just equality. And as a leader of an organization that is distinguishedly and intentionally dedicated to social justice, that means that in my role as its leader, I use the small bit of influence and discretionary power I may have to actually level the playing field for some of the most marginalized in our state. And so that's what social justice means to me in a 21st century world, which has obviously evolved quite a bit now that we are not only beyond the technical interpretation of the civil rights movement, but we're living in a pandemic that has changed everything for all of us.
Absolutely. I mean, just this common thread of what you all are saying around, I mean, human rights, I mean, goodness gracious, Dr. Cook, that is at its core what we're talking about, and then creating those spaces, taking those spaces. I love that. You know, it's not going to always be offered to you, right? You've got to kick in the door and create, or bring your own chair, right? We know that, pull up to that table. And I think that whole, what I heard you all saying around equity and really understanding that difference, I think is really, and then intentionality is certainly extremely important. So thank you. And Olivia, I'll just start with you and talk a little bit more about the social justice lens, and maybe, you know, it being tied really to access. And they say that access is the gateway to inclusion. And so if you can talk a little bit more for a few minutes on what is all of that? What does that mean to you, a social justice lens?
Yeah, absolutely. So as one of the 5 pillars of social justice, right, access refers to me the right to opportunity. So it's the extent to which different socioeconomic groups or individuals receive equal opportunities for goods, services, or what have you. So access is incredibly important. To me, it's the crux of a lot of the things that we do, right? So being able to access essentials such as shelter, such as food, such as education, good healthcare, all of those are critically important for a just society. So if access is restricted in a kind of way based on a person's gender, based on their race, based on their sexuality, based on their creed, based on their nationality, or what have you, it can create, you know, those injustices that we see. It can create some of those systemic institutional inequalities that we see as well. So it's really our goal in terms of access to increase and restore that access for those people who have been marginalized in those specific areas. And like, as I was saying before, my research has heavily focused on African-American women in general, and African-American women leaders, because I always feel like we're at the bottom of the totem pole, you know, for a lot of different things. And I'm like, man, why are we always here when we have done so much work to get there, you know? And we have been in those social movements and been at the crux of a lot of the advancements that we have seen in society. And so it, as Lenice has noted with James Baldwin's quote, it enrages me, you know, that we have been left behind. And so for me, access as being this gateway to inclusion and participation, it's important because it breaks down those barriers to entry, right? So for so long, we've had barriers put in place, particularly through policies. A lot of people don't know and probably don't read those policies, but it's intertwined and interwoven into the policies. And those have hindered inclusion, participation, diversity, belonging. It has hindered a lot of those things that really impact everybody, not just people of color, not just underrepresented groups. It impacts more than just, you know, what we can see physically. And so when we invite access in the conversation and we allow it to be the crux of what we do, we can begin to identify those individuals and groups that need to be included and the best way that is a benefit to them, not to us, but what benefits them the most, right? So that we can have this term equity be at the table and not just equality. And so when we include those voices that have been marginalized, it actually helps move our society forward. And so in thinking about ways we can include the voices is, for me, understanding and taking their perspectives on society and taking them seriously. And so I think about healthcare as it relates to Black women and Black mothers, right? And as it relates to the maternal death rate. And so we hear a lot about a lot of Black women dying, during childbirth. And it's because of that pre, during, or post delivery that they're having complications, they're having problems, and they're telling their healthcare provider about X, Y, and Z, but their healthcare provider isn't listening. They aren't taking them seriously, right? And so for me, it's actually leaning in and listening to those stories. And that's why it's important as it relates to my work to share the stories of Black women, to share those stories so that not just other Black women can benefit, but other folks can benefit in general, as it relates to leadership and ascending to those positions, and really just helping us create a more just society. And so I say that because we can't always assume we know the solution to a problem, especially if that problem may be affecting other people differently. So we must always, look at things in this access lens, in this social justice lens, so that we're creating those opportunities for people, especially for those of underrepresented groups. And so when we talk about access, definitely being able to help and enable groups to participate in those spaces, as Dr. Allen mentioned, it's important to take up space, to show up authentically as your whole self, as your full self when you are in those spaces. So to me, taking part, it means having that proverbial seat at the table, but not just for yourself, but so that you can create room for someone else when you are at that proverbial seat at the table. And it means acknowledging that purpose when you're there, and acknowledging those similarities as well as those differences. So access is incredibly important.
Absolutely.
It's the crux of those pillars of social justice, right? So when we have access, as I said, as it relates to even healthcare, education, food, what have you, it opens those doors. It creates those opportunities that allow other folks to live a better life. I think fairness and being right, I think that is right. So
that is right. Yeah. And I don't mean it to, but it just really, I wonder if you say other people, and I think a part of the challenge, if you will, when we talk about social justice, and I think later we can talk about this if there's time, is that this feels for a lot of people to be a separate thing that you do, right? You do this thing and we do social justice. And so I know that that's a bit of our challenge, is figuring out how to better communicate that it is everything. This is why you should care. And so that part, and so I like that you're incorporating, it benefits all of us. And so thank you for doing that.
Absolutely.
Yes. Michelle, now, as we're applying this social justice lens, as Dr. Cook just mentioned around access, and agency is something that we talked about, you put space, as you were speaking to a moment ago. What does it mean for people to have personal agency, the personal agency they need to make sure that their voices are heard? Can you help us dig into that a little bit?
Absolutely. And I just think this program is so well structured because, you can't get to agency without access, right? So having Dr. Cook speak before I go into this is absolutely necessary. So after you have access or take access, the next step is to be given agency. And agency essentially is being able to name myself for myself and righteously claim space as I so choose, right? And so the ideas, when we really think about agency, it is a shifting of hegemonic structures, right? A reshifting, a redistribution of power, right? And so the idea is to really consider how agency has been applied or hasn't been applied, particularly to Black women historically. And I have a little example to help us think about this. If we were to think about the plight of Black women throughout time, right? If we start with the feminist movement, right? If we're thinking about with Lucretia Mott and Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, right? The idea at that time was, yeah, we're all fighting for all women, but not Black women, right? It's like women, but whiteness is what's most important here, right? Even Lucretia Mott was quoted saying, or Elizabeth Cady Stanton was quoted saying, I'm going to paraphrase here, but essentially she was like, yeah, we all want voter rights, but I know you aren't going to give voter rights to Black men before you give it to white women, because we are white, right? And Black women weren't even in that conversation until Sojourner Truth came in, right? And offered some level of dialogue, but even still, agency was not applied. Then we get to the civil rights movement and we think about the plight of Black people at the time. And then Black women were asked to sort of take a seat to the back, right? You know, you have Fannie Lou Hamer and Diane Nash and so many others that were said, you know, yes, we understand that there's some nuance around being a woman, but Blackness is what's most important right now. We all need to be on the same page as it relates to fighting for equal rights for Black people. Then we get to the 21st century now, where you have everyone proclaiming Black Lives Matter. But then when Billy Porter comes in and says Black trans lives matter, everyone's like, well, no. We're talking about Black people right now. So it's this complete lack of understanding around intersectionality, which is coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, which starts to bring in this conversation around who's allowed to have agency in this system, right? And who isn't. And when we think about it, and I think Dr. Cook touched on this a little bit, when we think about systems and systemic oppression or systematic oppression, I said or, I mean and, because they are two separate concepts. And I don't think people often think about that as it relates to agency. Systemic means it's pervasive, right? It's throughout the entire system. I think Lenice brought this up, thinking about you can't step outside if you're conscious. You can't step outside without encountering some level of marginalization. And not that we want people to go out looking for ways to be hurt, but it exists. And to not acknowledge it is doing all of us a disservice, right? So the idea is when we go and really think about the impact of agency and systemic, that means it's pervasive. Systematic means it's intentional, it's deliberate, right? Done with thought. And so an example of that, systemic would be racism. Systematic would be what we're seeing with the restrictive voter laws right now and redlining. Who can vote? What do you need to present to vote? Right? That's what we mean. Systemic, that's racism is systemic. The policies and laws that are being enacted today, the way that Black women aren't allowed to speak about what's going on with our bodies, the way people don't believe our pain, right? Going to the Black maternal health stats that Dr. Cook referenced. Right? Why aren't people listening? Why aren't they believing us? So it is being given a seat at the table, but it's also being allowed to have a microphone to amplify voice, right? And I think that all plays into this idea of agency. Do I have the authority to speak for myself, or am I always relying or being defaulted to let white women speak for Black women, let men speak for Black women? When do Black women get to speak for themselves, and how can we continue to amplify voice for marginalized identities within the understanding of Black womanhood, right? I.e. queer identities or women of varying abilities or people from lower socioeconomic statuses. The idea is to be able to claim space, like I mentioned, but then being able to name and speak and articulate my needs, and they actually be received and heard.
Wow. My goodness, thank you so much. Do I have the authority to speak for myself?
Exactly.
Seems so basic. Lenice, we understand that advocacy, here we go in order. Oh boy, I love that. Bringing that to advocacy now. It's a deliberate process to influence an outcome or effectuate change. It takes advocacy. What are your thoughts around this advocacy process?
Sure. Well, all the endorphins in my body are going crazy because Dr. Allen is just, the speaking in a vernacular, she's all in our organization's Kool-Aid, and she seems to actually know the flavor. When you talk about intersectionality, when you talk about centering whiteness, when you talk about what it means as a Black woman or a Black person, period, to go to the doctor, you have worked hard to have health insurance, which for many of us is very expensive. And you go there and you do all the right things and you tell them what's bothering you and that you're in pain, and they don't listen, because Black people obviously don't experience pain in the same way that other people do. And so when you talk about advocacy, you know, I guess a technical definition of that would just be, you know, what it means to really to promote the interests or cause of someone or a group of people. Now, you know, because I am churched, you know, I'm a true Southern Alabamian who is churched. And what that means is that I grew up in the Black church tradition. So if I were to use church vernacular, I would say that what it means is to stand in the gap for others. So, you know, in the Black church, when someone shows up and they have needs and, you know, there is this disconnect between their situation and what would be ideal. And sometimes when, you know, there are not tangible ways and we can meet those needs in the spirit realm, what we do is we say, we're going to pray for them. And we're going to coalesce all the other saints around this person, their condition, to sort of go in prayer and sort of advocate for them before the Lord. And so, you know, advocacy is sort of very emblematic of that, if you would. An advocate is something that anyone can do. It can be done, you know, as a group sport, if you would, or it could be done as an individual. But what I will say is that at the end of the day, what it boils down to is really giving voice to people. And why is that important, one might ask? Well, it's important to give voice to people because people or someone will listen. All we have to do is look at social media, right? And you see the thousands, if not millions of videos, of shows of how, you know, to cook a particular meal. And some people merely have the goal of being famous. I mean, you can show up on social media every day talking about eating crabs, right? And you can become famous in this country, in this season, just by simply eating crabs because someone is out there watching, someone is out there listening. Videos go viral in the context of this, right? And so people will listen. So communication really remains one of the most powerful tools known to man. I mean, people understand this in very specific and unique ways now in the 21st century world. And we're willing to use the utility of language and words and expressions and myriad mediums to really advance many a causes. And so when one asks, and I'm often asked, you know, how does one successfully advocate for other people or on behalf of other people? And whether I'm asked this question in the context of what it means to be an ally, you know, in the world of racial justice, my one and immediate response is always the same: empathy. If one does not have the ability to have empathy, or if one has the inability to be empathetic, which means to consider what it must be like to be in another's shoes, to consider just even mentally what it must mean to be in the plight of another person. And so if we're going to be advocates, if we're going to be racial or gender equity or LGBTQ, whatever cause, right, that you decide that you want to put your hand to the plow, you must first be able to be empathetic. And so I've seen this so many times. Good white people who want to be a part of this work, some of the most agonizing experiences I have had is dealing with white liberals who say that they want to be a part of this work. But when you really start pulling back the layers of the situation, really know what it means to sit with people in their situations, well, then all of a sudden it becomes too difficult, it becomes too challenging. And so we have to just understand and know that that is really the first step. And when we think about advocacy really in terms of, you know, well, what do I do? You know, how do I really, in a very simplistic way, become a part of being an advocacy group? You know, what does it really take? What are some of the elements really of advocacy? Well, the first thing is that you have to be aware. I think I have just quite naively been appalled at how much people don't know about what's going on in the world. You know, in the movie Boys in the Hood, you know, he said either people don't know or they don't show what's going on in the hood. And that's real. People really have no clue. And I ain't just talking about white people, I'm talking about Black people. Black people oftentimes who are of a certain economic status even, we are oblivious to the conditions that poor and marginalized people are living and contending in right here in the state of Alabama. 25 miles from where I am sitting right now is a community called Lowndes County. And in Lowndes County, in a 21st century world, people are living with raw sewage under their homes and in their yards because they don't have the proper wastewater management infrastructure in their communities. But a quarter of a mile up the street, they figured out at Priestess Pecan, a white business, how to put the infrastructure in. But a quarter of a mile away from that business, you have people who are living to which the special rapporteur of the United Nations called and akin it to third world poverty. This man goes around the world looking at poverty. He goes to Lowndes County and he looks at the conditions of the people and he akins it to third world poverty in a first world country. That is unacceptable. We must be aware. We must be willing to analyze the impact that these situations are having on our communities. And then we have to really move into having very specific action plans. And so now you have to stop me because I'm the daughter of a preacher's kid.
I'm bobbing the head here because I tell you, it is, just everything that you all are saying is just, one of my questions is going to be to all of you is, why should people care? If you are not a part of a marginalized group, why should you care? And so I think that is some of the struggles that you may hear sometimes. Why are we, not talking about X? And I think that we want to let everyone know why should they care? Why is it important to people who are not a part of a marginalized group to advocate?
Is that question directed directly at Lenice?
Either, any of you, yeah.
Well, for me, I think first we have to really get people to deconstruct what they think marginalized means, right? Because marginalization implies that it's situational and it's contextual. So, when we start to think about minoritized and subordinate, those things are systemic, but marginalization is subjective and it hasn't come for you yet. And if you sit idly by and let other people's rights be trampled upon, let other people have their agency stripped from them, have their access removed from them, and you refuse to advocate, then it's only a matter of time before they come knocking on your door to talk to you about what rights you think you have and how they can take those away for the better good of whatever the agenda is at the time. And so I think the idea of being conscientious community members, I think Dr. Cook touched on it and said being able to step outside of myself and consider someone else. Lenice brought up the empathy. That's exactly what that is, a decentering of me, being able to say, let me see what you're experiencing. And in saying something in me is tapping into something in you. And I feel connected and compelled to do something. And I think we live in such a time where it's so easy to get forced into these silos. And then it doesn't help that the media cycle tells us what to care about in any given moment. That's why Gil Scott-Heron said the revolution will not be televised. Because you have to be plugged in. You have to be tuned into the conversation because you could be focused on what's going on with any political court case or what's going on with the Supreme Court justice, and then the media will stop covering it. And it will make it seem as though it just went away, but it did not.
It's still
right?
there.
Yeah, people can stop talking about Flint, but Flint still exists. People can stop talking about Lowndes County, but those people are still suffering, right? We can stop talking about the fact that if you're born poor in Atlanta, there's a 92% chance that you're going to die poor in Atlanta, a city that's known as a mecca for Black African-American culture. And if we can stop talking about it, but it's still going to be there.
It's still there. Yeah, Dr. Cook, let me pull you in here. What are your thoughts? Why should people care?
Yes, so really piggybacking off of what Dr. Allen has said, and you mentioned it's not always about me. And I can just retweet. It's not always just about you. And when you think about how to get other folks to care, when you get outside of yourself and you start to think about other folks and their problems and their things and what they're going through, back to what Ms. Emanuel has said, you develop some empathy. You develop saying, okay, let me figure out how I can, help in this situation. And it's always important to to help and to serve in that way, because it pushes the collective betterment of society in that way as well. And so for me, piggybacking off of Lenice, what you mentioned earlier, being a church girl and a Southern girl, I can definitely relate to that as well. And it's almost, for me, growing up in the church, you hear about, you know, when you pray for someone else, your problems, they get solved because you're focusing on someone else. You're focusing on their problems. You're focusing on, you know, what they're going through, but yours will get solved as well, you know, when you take your mind off of what you're going through. And I think that same sort of mindset can be applied when you think about, why should I care? You should care, because when you focus on other folks and their problems and their things, whatever you're going through, it'll get solved. You know, when you have some empathy and you have some care in the world, I think it's cyclical. It always comes back. It always comes back to you, you know?
I love that. Let's go to, we do have one, I think one question right now in the chat box, and let's see. This person says that they love these crucial conversations around equity and justice, even when it gets heated, but it's always bothered them that when there's a reluctance to include the rest of the world in the conversation of social justice, similar to how white women were reluctant to include Black women in suffrage, like you mentioned. So do you think including the rest of the world in these conversations is helpful, even when discussing American issues, or is it too cumbersome to discuss that wide of a scale? And who would like to take that one on? Do you kind of understand the question? The question is,
I don't want to
we hear about Black people all the time, basically, because I think it's a part of it. And how do you include other people in the conversation, which is a fair question.
Yeah, I don't want to call anyone in on this, but Lenice, you seem to have some of the explanations that you've offered so far. I have some thoughts, but I feel like you should take the first jump at this one.
Well, you know, as an organization that not only, you know, advocate for the dismantling of systems of oppression, we all are also an organization on the other end of that is committed to racial healing and reconciliation. And what we've learned, you know, I'll share, you know, I'm a woman of analogies, right? So another analogy is like before desegregation, right? As Black people, we all lived in the same community, right? The doctors, you know, Dr. Michelle and Dr. Cook and Dr. Magras, y'all all been on the same street, you know, potentially with me, you know, as a domestic worker potentially, okay? And so after desegregation, you know, before desegregation, we were all kind of coalesced as a community, right? Around the same ideas, the same goals. It wasn't really difficult to sort of get us organized around sort of common interests and goals. But after desegregation, really, you know, it kind of created a schism in our community, right? Where, you know, honey, now it's hard to just get us organized to do a church picnic, right? You know, I mean, and it's because the issues have now become so much more complex. So specific to this question, what I would say is that because of the complexity of some of these issues, first of all, Black people have always invited white people to the table to have these conversations. You know, the truth of the matter is that, you know, are you willing to sit at the table and hear hard truths? You know, one of the people that I admire the most in this country is Brian Stevenson, who had the gall, right, to lift up these monuments that tells the truth about what happened in this country and the places in, you know, across the country and here in Alabama where people have been lynched. And in some cases, they were never properly buried or memorialized, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a centering of truth that is so much a part of this that it takes a certain capacity, I think, in order to be able to come to the table and stay to the table. But I do think because of internalized oppression and because of things like white privilege, there are ways that this work can be done where we separate into those groups and do some of the kind of internal work that actually needs to be done and then bring people together. So I think it's, you know, it's dependent upon the situation, how you look at it. But this idea that these conversations have been isolated, the truth of the matter is that Black folks, we're tired of being the only people out here talking about race. Black women, we're tired of being the only ones like, hear me, see me, you know, acknowledge me. And so I think there is room and there is a myriad of opportunities for people to be engaged in this work. But first of all, you got to wanna, point blank and a period, and that would be with the T at the end.
Period. Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in on this one? We want to go to the next question.
Yeah, I would like to chime in. And for me, my point is, I think it's important to include the rest of the world because Black folks aren't just in America, you know, and inequalities aren't just in America. Inequities aren't just in America. They're everywhere, you know, and I think we saw that explicitly after the brutal death of Mr. George Floyd, where it wasn't just protests and movements happening here in the United States. They were happening in other countries, you know, to where this became a huge issue and for our society and for us as a whole. So it's important to include those voices and to continue the conversation with the rest of the world, because it's affecting not just us, but other people as well. And it's important to continue that conversation and continue to have other groups, even if they felt like or feel like they aren't being marginalized, to have them at that table, because you know, just as I said, Lenice mentioned earlier, that empathy, having that at the table as well, it's important because it helps us as a society and moves us forward if we want to have some collective change.
Mm-hmm. Collective change, yes.
I just have one thing to add to that before we move forward. Yeah. I think the biggest thing is, I think it's to Dr. Cook's point and Lenice's point, I think it's necessary to bring in people that may not be a part of the community to assist in the movement and the move for social justice. But I think it's also important that we don't spend so long trying to bring people on board that it keeps us from moving forward. I am a big fan of galvanizing the people that are of like minds and we move forward. I'm also a big fan of understanding stratifications within the movement, right? I think Lenice touched on this a little bit, but I think as we are looking for what progress looks like, there has to be people on the outside that are galvanizing forces and bringing in troops and reinforcement. But then there also have to be people that are internal to the community and working to strengthen the community while we actively reach outward and bring people on board to help. I'm just not a big fan. It's hard to educate and advocate at the same time. And so that's where the stratifications have to be important. We have to have people that are dedicated to saying, I'm willing to unlearn and relearn what I know about oppression, marginalization, white supremacy, capitalism, sexism, misogyny, all of those things. And then there has to be people that are willing to say, I understand that already, and I'm ready to take it and take the charge and move forward. I'm going to reach back as I climb, but I can't stay there with you right now. There are other people here to help. And I think we really don't understand that, because for some people, I think they see that as a splintering, but I see it as being working with synergy, right? And understanding your focus and your role in the movement. So I think that part is important.
Dr. Magras, can I just add one little thing to what she's saying? Because this is so important, and she just nailed it. That when we do, you got to do both ends. So she's point on with that, but also like when we do these movements and these active and these campaigns, it has to be tied into a larger strategy. You know, the idea that we do these things sort of just extemporaneously and we're just being reactionary or whatever, you know, there are times when, you know, you kill a man 8 minutes, you know, on a video, yeah, everybody needs to hit the streets and there needs to be, but you know, we got to be more intentional and we've got to have strategies, as she's saying, and our efforts must be tied into larger strategies so that ultimately we can impact those sort of those symptomatic things that Dr. Cook talked about earlier, those policies and those things that actually give life to the foundational system of racism in this country.
Yeah, yes, not just talk about the issue, but really moving it forward through policy change. I think is extremely important. Let's see, another question. I think we do here. Maybe that's the same one there. So we talked a little bit about the solidarity, right, in action, and we're referring to a need to improve the lives of the whole, whether it's our community, our country, or our world. And I think I heard you say, Dr. Cook, the collective betterment requires us to recognize injustice and work across differences to find common ground. And I think that's what we've been talking about here. And at the YW, we work to empower women. We work at that intersection, and I've heard that today as well, that intersection of gender and race. And we're proud of that work. Can you talk a little bit about what is this collective betterment? And I think we have, but if there's anything else to kind of add there, but in your personal and or professional life, the collective betterment. And Dr. Cook, if you, I'm fine with, yeah, if you want to go there. Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll speak from a more personal standpoint as it relates to collective betterment. So within my research, mentorship has been incredibly important as it relates to this collective betterment and making sure that we're also lifting as we climb, you know, as we get in these positions and things. And so even for me with my research on the African American women senior leaders and their advancements to senior leadership positions, mentorship showed up with everyone, with all of them, you know, within that space. And so for me, contributing to that collective betterment of society is also, once I'm in that space, making room for other folks to be in that space with me, especially other folks who look like me, you know, because as I mentioned earlier, we don't see a lot of folks in the spaces who look like the four of us, you know, on the call. And so when you do have opportunities like this, I think it's so important to be a mentor to someone else. And it's important to show them the ropes, quote unquote, if you will. And it's not always, oh, someone needs to seek me out to be a mentor. It's also me seeking someone else out to mentor them, you know, because I feel like it's that cyclical relationship in terms of I'm learning and so are you. And so it's not always they have to seek me out if they want to be, you know, mentored by me or what have you. It's me saying, no, I want to grow that person because I know that person can take up space, as Dr. Allen mentioned, and create more space for someone else.
Love that. Love that. You know, you hear often that if you're in this work, that you have to remember to take care of yourself. What does that mean to you? And why is that? Why is that statement made, really? What does that mean?
Yeah, if I could be transparent, I will say, you know, when people say take care of yourself, it's something I often struggle with because I feel like I going back to the collective betterment statement, part of my understanding about how I contribute to that is transparency in the journey, transparency in the struggles, and transparency, you know, about the victories as well. But that also means that, and this is not a boost in the ego, but it means I become a visual representation for some people, right? And that, for me, that puts a little bit of weight on it because someone's like, well, you're showing us the journey. So what's happening, right? And then there becomes almost like an obligation to that transparency, but then also it becomes a factor of, well, I'm giving because they may not have anywhere else to see a representation like this. So for example, I've had students share with me that I am the only openly out queer identified Black woman in leadership at the institution that they know of. I'm like, that can't be true. And they're like, well, no, there are other Black women, but I don't think any are part of the LGBTQ community. And I'm like, okay. So then when they contact me and say, I want to know how you did this, I feel compelled to give of myself because I know what it feels like to not have that representation, to look at an institution and see that the highest ranking Black woman is an assistant director and say, you know what, I need to leave that institution and go to a place where our vice president of DEI is a Black woman. That so happens to be my Sarah as well, but shameless plug. But the idea is that it feels like something where I know what I didn't have, and standing in that gap, going into Lenice's statement, wanting to stand in that gap for future generations, which means I'm constantly pouring and pouring. So that point of self-care sometimes falls to the wayside. But I'm understanding, particularly as I get older, and me and my friends joke about being a woman of a certain age, right? I am learning that I can't continue to pour out because then I don't have anything left for me, for my family, or to contribute to the work. So I'm trying to find restorative places. This feels like, I mean, for some people may see this as work, but this feels like restoration to me, right? Being able to be here on this call with you all, these things feel good. I'm able to communicate with people that understand and really have an intentional dialogue. And so I try to find those moments of restoration. Might be listening to a podcast. It might be having a conversation with a friend, or it might just be going out on the weekend and doing what I need to do to relax, right? And so I try to find those times, but I'll be honest and say sometimes it's difficult because I want to be what I didn't have. And that sometimes is a heavy burden or a heavy load to carry.
Heavy load. Thank you for that. I know I do want to get to, we may have about 3 questions here, I think. Checking the chat here. Someone just commented that caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It's self-preservation, right? And that is an act of political. Well, yeah, that's Audre Lorde. So yeah, I saw a question here. Let's see. Someone wanted to speak to, I'm not sure if either of you feel like you can speak to, I think mental health is really where this person is going, like just mental health among a lot of young people, particularly Black, I think, children committing suicide and things of that nature. And we generally would have to give a disclaimer here. You know, I don't really want to go really too far in there, but just to say that mental health, I think in general right now is really amplified, even more so during the pandemic for a lot of people and for a lot of reasons. Can someone speak to advocacy fatigue?
Oh, I can.
Like when is the time to just like step away for a bit? So yes, Lenice, let us know. What is this?
Yeah, well, that I have a few mentors that's on this call, and that is Claire Milligan, one of my mentors. That's all in the comments, lifting up mental health, and even self-care, which is something my mentors are often on me about. But advocacy fatigue and Black fatigue is real. I've only been in this job, you know, I'm an official YWCA sister, having actually been a CEO of 2 other YWCAs before becoming executive director of this organization. But this work that I do with this organization, I thought I was tired with the YWCA, but honey, I've only been in this job for 6 years, and I swear to God, I feel like I've been here for 30 years, you know, because the work is really hard. It is literally some of the hardest work that I've ever done. And it's because I often say, you know, that because, you know, with the YWCA, for example, we had earned income opportunities, right? Either through our childcare facilities or programs, you know, but in this role, I'm basically selling freedom. And ain't nobody really, these folks in Alabama in particular, are not trying to invest in strategies that are going to dismantle these systems in which they benefit from. And so it's really hard to raise money. We're mostly tired because we don't have enough resources to do the work. So I am the executive director. I am the social media person. I am the person who writes the articles and the newsletters. I am the person who has to come on a panel like this and represent the organization. I am every woman, literally. But the work is necessary, and I wouldn't want to be doing anything else and feel, you know, poignantly called to do this work. But advocacy fatigue is very real. We have to really be intentional about trying to do self-care. And for me, I know y'all saw is on this call. I was mentioning to you before, Rondrea Young, who has been in my life since my college days. She's been a mentor and a friend. But for me, self-care literally could be going to her house and eating a meal and sitting around just laughing and talking, and not be trying to answer 50 texts and working up to 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, and really surrounding yourself with people who will pour into you. And, you know, and this is what these women do for me. You know, I think that there is nothing on the planet more beautiful and more powerful than a Black woman, not because of our own innate ability to just be overcomers, but the way we nurture and care and cuddle each other. It's just something to me that is priceless. And I am blessed to have that in my life. And that is a lot of the way that I have basically addressed and really worked towards healing myself in the context of advocacy fatigue.
Thank you. Let's see, we have one here in our Q&A section that says, I'm a middle-aged white woman along with 3 others who have been reading, learning, discussing about social justice for the past few years. We are teaching some classes in our mainly white churches in order to lead others to this work. What suggestions do you have for us who are seeking ways to engage in the work of social justice, but don't want to overstep and don't know how to be effective? And they're very much interested in this conversation, and thanking you for this conversation.
I would say start off if there's a particular organization of interest for you, you know, sort of go to that organization and ask. Well, first state your intention, right? And own some of the privileged identities that may be a part of who you are. You know, one being white that I saw that you named, and being a woman, there's some privilege in there as well. And saying, I know that, right? But I can use that for the greater good. It's not to deny the privilege that we all have, but it's to use it to amplify and lift others. So go to that organization and say, I'm owning my privilege. I know there's some gaps in my understanding. How can I be effective? I think often when we go to work with organizations or marginalized groups, we assume that they know our intention just because we showed up. That's not true. We've seen people show up in our spaces and do terrible things, right? And so I'm thinking specifically about Charleston, right? So the idea is to go to the organization, own your privilege and say, how can I be of assistance? And then really working to fill that gap and say, these are the tools that I have. Can they be of use to you? I'm thinking about, I have friends that are a part of the Asian diaspora. And when the women were killed in Atlanta, and we saw a lot of hate as a result of some of the hateful rhetoric that was coming around the cause of the coronavirus, being spewed at East Asian folks, I went to my friends of Asian descent and said, how can I be of support, right? I have a platform. I have the ability to provide education. I don't want to overstep. I don't want to be in the front unless you need me to, but how can I be of support? And my friend said, if you could promote these organizations that people could donate to, if you can use your social media to just post this picture, because a lot of people are sort of digging in and saying, well, I'm not Asian, so it doesn't have anything to do with me, and just bring that awareness. And I said, absolutely, if there's anything else I can do. So it's always leveraging your proximity to that community to state your intentions and then ask, how can I be of service? As opposed to saying, I'm going to come in and do this, right? We've had a lot of that, right? And that's what we want to avoid at this juncture, right? The idea is to be able to ask the question and then fill the gap.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I hope that answered that for them. I think that was just profound. It's filling that gap. So sometimes, because this journey is tough, and it's a journey, it's perpetual, right? We're it's not a one and done. How or when do we recognize the gains that we've made? Like, when do we take some time to celebrate? Sometimes it just feels like there's, you're just continuously like fighting this battle. What do we have that we can say, we can celebrate? Let's say over the last 5 years, I don't know, or within the last couple of years. Anything you would like to share?
Yikes, the fact that we have radio silence, I don't know if that's the best.
Look, it is what it is sometimes, right? You got a lot of work to do. And what's very interesting is that we're all in this work, and we chose to be in this work. And I think that is you're either crazy or you're really passionate about it, right? And you believe in it wholeheartedly. And so I think the fact that we're able to have these conversations, and the fact that even the person who had the question about how can I be involved, I think that's progress, certainly. Dr. Cook, you.
Yeah, well, I know for me, thinking at the national scale, and we're looking at, we have a Supreme Court justice seat that is now open, and now we have 3 Black women who have made the short list, and President Biden has said that he would, nominate a Black woman to be in that space. Although, of course, it's like, man, it took so long to get a Black woman to say, oh, she'll be nominated to be in that space. I think that is some type of progress in this space, to have a Black woman's name being mentioned, to say, yeah, I'll give her a nod, to be at this high-ranking Supreme Court of the land. So I think that's a nod. That's saying, okay, we're doing something. Something is happening. Something is brewing.
Feeling growing.
Right. And, honestly, it's always about celebrating the small wins, regardless of how small they are, because they push us forward. They push us, to that next space and celebrating a big win. So it's so important to to not just, think about all the things that we have to tackle and that plight and that struggle, and what have you, and how this work can be, I can see myself 1-2 o'clock in the morning, I'm still trying to, Lenice, as you mentioned, being the social media person, being the person to write this
We have
grant.
to be all things.
I have to do all the things, right?
Yes,
Right. And
yes.
particularly for me, this position that I'm in is such a new position. I've only been in here 5 months. So I'm still trying to learn the ropes and still trying to learn.
And that's how we do it, right? We're going to do a real quick lightning round. We have 1 minute. I really want to know, what podcast do we need to check out? What book? Just give me one thing for each of you. And I'll start with you, Dr. Allen. What do we need to?
I think you can't enter this work without reading Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider. It's the book it's the book that radicalized me. And then I'm going to also throw in there a podcast, Read This, Read That, with Jackie Reed and Joy Reid. I think their take on some of the socio-political conversations that we're all having is very enlightening. It's informative, and then also adds a little levity to the conversation as well.
All right, Lenice.
I listen to Dr. Anita Phillips every single night. She is a Christian professional counselor who deals with mental health issues. It is what I call free counseling for myself. And so I would advise and encourage everyone to check her out. And then I'm just going to lift up a book that the mentor that's probably been in my life the longest, Commissioner Merceria Ludgood down in Mobile, Alabama. The first book that she gave me that sort of harnessed my passion for this work was Sal Alinsky's Rules for Radical. I think anyone that's really interested in movement work and change work should definitely read that book.
All right. Thank you. Dr. Cook.
Yeah, I would have to say a podcast that I listen to is Wind Down Wednesdays with Jeffrey Tobias Halter and Amanda Hammond. It's a new podcast that has just come out, but Jeffrey Tobias, he was the director of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Coca-Cola, the first director there. And so listening to those podcasts, they're only about 10 to 15 minutes, but they broaden your perspective on the different social justice issues as it relates to age, race, gender, color, creed, what have you.
Noted, ladies. Thank you so much for this rich conversation, and for helping us actually kick off our 2022 YWe Talks. I am so grateful to you all, and for all of you who are here today. Check out YWCABHAM.org or follow us at YW Central AL on all of our social media, and to check out the next YWe Talk episodes. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
for having us.